In this lecture segment, I'm going to present some of my thoughts on making corporate social responsibility strategic. In order to maximize the benefit of this segment, it's important that you have done three things prior to viewing this video. The first is to have read the Reason magazine debate on rethinking the social responsibility of business. This is the debate that featured Milton Friedman, Whole Foods' John Mackey, and T.J. Rogers from Cypress Semiconductor. The second thing that you should have done prior to viewing this video is to read the article by Anil Karnani in the Wall Street Journal entitled "The Case Against Corporate Social Responsibility." And the third, and perhaps the most important thing, is that you should have gone to the discussion area within Blackboard under the mandatory corporate social responsibility thread and posted your thoughts and responses to the question that I posed, as well as the responses of your classmates, in order to get the debate out on the table prior to viewing this video segment. If you haven't done all three of those things, I ask you to stop viewing the segment at this point and come back to it later. If you're still listening, I assume that you've done the pre-work and the pre-reading and are ready to proceed. And the way we'll begin is with the quotation that predicated and led to all of the debate that you read in the Reason article. This is the one from Milton Friedman saying that there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. This quotation is one of the more famous indictments of the idea of CSR. This is due in part to the worldwide reputation that Friedman enjoyed as a Nobel laureate, but it's also due to the fact that he often wrote to the larger non-academic audience. In fact, his central arguments about CSR were summarized in a 1975 New York Times Magazine article that continues to be referenced today. Now, Friedman's position is clear, even when the quotation is extended to show that he was not advocating an anything-goes version of capitalism. It's worth noting that this last part of the quotation is often omitted by his critics. That said, Friedman can never be said to be soft on CSR. He made it clear that he viewed CSR as a, quote, misappropriation of shareholder wealth, end quote, insofar as it places the rights of stakeholders on a par with those of the corporation's shareholders. Friedman believed that there was an irreconcilable tension between the maximization of profits as an end from the corporation's point of view and the social perspective that this is simply a means to another end, for instance, achieving certain social objectives. While Friedman is no longer with us, his influence remains, even as recently as the 2010 special report in the Wall Street Journal that you read by Anil Karnani from the University of Michigan on the case against corporate social responsibility. Again, Karnani speaks to the tension between shareholders and stakeholders when he says that the idea that companies have a responsibility to act in the public interest and will profit from doing so is fundamentally flawed. That said, it's hard to find anyone who makes the case as clearly as Al Dunlop of Chainsaw Al Dunlop fame, the former CEO at Scott Paper and Sunbeam Corporation, when he talks about running away from the companies that use the term stakeholders in their annual reports. In fact, he goes on saying that he doesn't understand why people are worried about stakeholders, because stakeholders don't pay a penny for their stake. There's only one constituency that he's concerned about, and that is shareholders. So as you can see, CSR is certainly good for generating some entertaining quotations. But before we go any further, and to ensure that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology, I think we should take a step back and take a moment to understand just what we mean by CSR. And a great way of doing that is a framework that was presented by Carroll in terms of the 4 responsibilities of corporations. The first responsibility is a corporation's economic responsibility. That is, its responsibility to produce goods and services so that the firm can repay its creditors and shareholders. In other words, this is the firm's responsibility to be a going concern. The second responsibility that Carroll identifies of corporations are It's legal responsibilities, namely following the laws, that is, the formal codes that permit or forbid certain behaviors defined by governments. Carney maintains that corporations must do both the economic and legal, lest they run afoul of the authorities or good business practices. The next level of responsibility is what Carroll refers to as ethical responsibility. That is, those should do things that generally follow the beliefs about behavior in a society. Remember, ethics are consensually accepted standards of behavior versus morality, which has precepts that are based upon religious or philosophical beliefs. So the idea with these ethical responsibilities is that the corporation needs to act in a way that is consistent with the generally held beliefs about behavior in a society, even if those beliefs are not specifically called out in terms of legal requirements. For example, maybe fair working conditions, or specifically things like child labor, which may or may not be illegal in certain parts of the world, but certainly are viewed as ethically incorrect in Western society. Those are examples of ethical responsibilities. And finally, corporations have discretionary responsibilities, which are purely voluntary obligations that a corporation chooses to assume. Now, in Carroll's view, corporate social responsibility is the belief that a corporation has a broader responsibility to society than simply making a profit. So in this continuum, the corporation's economic and legal responsibilities are clearly not corporate social responsibility. However, the ethical and discretionary responsibilities are. Once again, corporate social responsibility is the belief that a corporation has a broader responsibility to society than simply making a profit. Now this then begs the question, why would a company do CSR? Well, one position that's been advanced is the fact that CSR is good business. Now, this was addressed in an article by Margolis and Effelbein, in which they completed an analysis of 167 studies conducted over a 35-year period, looking at whether there was a relationship between social responsibility and corporate profitability. Their conclusion were that while doing good doesn't appear to destroy shareholder value, they found an only small correlation between corporate behavior and good financial results. Moreover, the minor correlation that does exist could well be explained by deep pockets. They go on further to say that cash contributions to charities have shown a stronger correlation with success than have socially responsible corporate policies or community projects. So from their perspective, it's the view of cash contributions that have far more effect than any of a corporation's projects. Their advice is threefold. Number one, they say that corporate misdeeds are costly to companies if people find out, so it's better off not to do them. Number two, doing good is unlikely to cost shareholders, but by the same token, doing good is unlikely to maximize shareholder value. And thirdly, profitability should not be the primary rationale for corporate social responsibility. In fact, they end their article, which was published in the Harvard Business Review, with the comment that, quote, "It pays to be good, but not too good," end quote. In other words, do enough not to run afoul of regulators and activists, but not so much that you offend analysts and and investors. That's hardly an unqualified endorsement. Well, another reason why companies do CSR is because they believe that customers want, and more importantly, value CSR. This was studied by Trudel and Kott in a more recent Sloan Management Review article called "Does It Pay to Be Good?" The good news is that Trudel and Kott found that consumers are willing to pay substantially more for ethically produced goods than for unethically produced goods, suggesting that there is a financial reward for socially responsible behavior. That said, as shown in this quote, consumers perceived and rewarded all levels of ethical production similarly. They did not reward increasing levels of ethical production. So while there is some value from a customer perspective in being good, being better than good does not carry with it additional value from the customer's perspective. In fact, their conclusions was that the results show that gains may be made with ethical positioning in the marketplace, and thus companies' efforts to move toward ethical production and to promote that ethical behavior may appear to be wise investments. Now, while customers reward ethical production, the other thing they did find is that the negative effects of unethical behavior have a substantially greater impact on consumer willingness to pay than the positive effects of ethical behavior. In other words, consumers are far more punishing of unethical behavior than they are rewarding of ethical behavior. They go on to say that since there's no greater reward for more ethical behavior, as shown in the first half of the quote, public relations are going to be critically important in achieving price premiums for ethical company behavior. That almost sounds as though CSR is really PR, or public relations. Sounds like more advice to be good but not too good. Well, what's the problem here? Part of this can be explained by a framework that was developed by Father Oliver Williams from the University of Notre Dame and one of the founder of the United Nations Global Compact Foundation, which developed the Principles of Responsible Management Education, to which the Brennan School subscribes. Father Williams, who has served as our Christopher Chair of Business Ethics, has developed this model to help to explain how CSR is implemented differently by different companies to greater or lesser effect. What Father Williams says that at its most foundational, some companies engage in CSR as corporate philanthropy. In other words, they provide funding and some skills, but this has little strategic or operational impact. And unfortunately, that is the level of CSR present at most organizations. Moving up, some organizations, because of their industry or their particular business situation, view CSR as risk management. In other words, it's about compliance. This gets a little bit more into some of the arguments that we saw about avoiding the negative results of unethical behavior. And depending upon what happens, it might have some strategic and operational impact, but it's generally in the form of avoidance of punishment. And then finally, there are some innovative, sustainable business models that view CSR as value creation. These can have fundamental and operational impact. I like this framework because it can greatly help our understanding. What you have to be careful about, however, is that CSR becomes more than something like the adoption of a common values statement. Because when it's just about coming up with value statements, that almost encourages a check-the-box mentality with respect to CSR. Consider the following. Take a look at this 2000 Corporate Responsibility Annual Report. And I apologize that this is a little old, but you'll understand why in a minute. I'll give you a moment to read about the principles that this company addressed in its Corporate Responsibility Report. This company sounds amazing. Who wouldn't want to be affiliated with a company that deals with respect, the mutual respect with our communities and our shareholders, and stakeholders? Integrity, understanding the impacts, both positive and negative, of the business on the environment and society. Communications, in other words, fostering understanding. And excellence, continuing to improve performance and encourage business partners and suppliers to adhere to the same standards. Well, clearly, having a good set of value statements isn't enough. So what's the problem? Well, Simon Zedek has identified 5 stages that companies can reach in his article, The Path to Corporate Responsibility. And we're moving from the top to the bottom here. In the defensive stage, companies say, it's not our job, and they basically deny practices or responsibilities. There are very few companies that are still here today, but you can find them from time to time. In the compliance stage, companies do as much as they have to do in order to mitigate the economic damage due to litigation or other governmental regulations. In the managerial stage, CSR becomes business as usual. This is about the middle of Father Williams' picture. In the strategic stage, CSR can provide a competitive advantage because of enhanced economic value or maybe first mover advantage, which can then be turned into civil, in which CSR becomes something that everyone in a particular industry must do. What Zadek argues is that if you are a leading edge CSR player, you can strategically work with government officials to put in place requirements for similar behaviors that can actually help you to achieve at least a short-term competitive advantage. This gets back to the idea of the strategic choice perspective of strategic management, in which you'll recall organizations can influence the environment in which they compete. Now, I can't really argue with Zadek's methodologies or conclusions because I've seen so many companies approach CSR in this way. But I would argue that by definition, this bottoms-up approach is really part of the problem and not the solution. Indeed, its roots in tactics make it difficult or unlikely that CSR in a company will ever reach the strategic level, which is the reason why in many companies they stop out at that managerial level at best, and as often as not are stuck in compliance. I agree with Porter and Kramer, and since you know from past discussions, you know I am a Michael Porter fan, because they call for a more strategic or top-down approach to corporate social responsibility. And I highly recommend their article. As they say, to advance CSR, we must root it in a broad understanding of the interrelationship between a corporation and society, while at the same time, and this is key, anchoring it in the strategies and activities of specific companies. Specifically, they say to practice strategic CSR requires 3 steps. First, you identify points of intersection between a company and a society. In other words, where does the company interact with the society in which it operates? Second, select social issues to address, namely social needs that can help to create shared value. These are social issues that are of interest not just to society, but to the company itself. And then finally, third, mount a small number of initiatives that generate large and distinctive benefits for both the company and society. Now, as I said, I recommend this article to you. It's recently published in the Harvard Business Review, but they identify some examples of what they view as companies that do CSR strategically. Companies like Nestle's local sourcing of milk for its products, and as needed, the development of milk distribution systems to enable milk to get to market. Coca-Cola's commitment to ensuring clean water supplies. And Anglo American, this is an African mining company's work on the AIDS pandemic as an approach towards increasing labor productivity. Doing this, that is, anchoring CSR in the strategies and activities of the company, tackles the tension between CSR and corporate governance head-on, and I think it's the most sustainable approach. It is more than corporate philanthropy, more than risk management, it is strategic CSR. That said, and to be completely honest with you, even this approach is not without its critics. Let's go back to our friend and the article you read by Professor Kanani from the University of Michigan. In his case against CSR, he said, very simply, in cases where private profits and public interests are aligned, the idea of corporate social responsibility is irrelevant. It's irrelevant because companies that simply do everything they can to boost profits will end up increasing social welfare, so it would happen anyway. He goes on and says that in circumstances in which profits and social welfare are in direct opposition, an appeal to corporate responsibility will almost always be ineffective. He says ineffective because executives are unlikely to act voluntarily in the public interest and against shareholder interests. Irrelevant or ineffective. Now that's an indictment. Actually, Karnani says it's even worse than that. He says the danger is that a focus on CSR will delay or discourage more effective measures to enhance social welfare in those cases where profits and the public goods are at odds. As society looks to companies to address these problems, the real solutions may be ignored. Yipes. Well, I believe that while Karnani makes some good points, he is understating the value in a strategic approach to CSR. And that, as Rosabeth Moss Kanter, she was the former editor of the Harvard Business Review, says in her recent book, Supercorp, if a company can integrate the benefits that it offers society more closely into its existing business, that integration can be very sensible and beneficial for the business. Because if we make CSR strategic, we will follow both the letter and the spirit of the law that Milton Friedman laid down nearly 50 years ago. And that is the secret to making money in the long term. That is, anchoring our CSR activities in the strategies and activities of our company. Thank you.